Hi, I've been working on some animated comics as a hobby, so I'm not a professional filmmaker by any means. And as part of it, I've been learning how to put together stories and scripts. And what I thought I'd do here is just share some of my learnings in case it's useful to anybody else. One of the first discoveries was the Poetics. And Poetics it appears actually to be a series of notes, possibly written by his students of Aristotle. So this is about 350 BC. And it's interesting that the way and the knowledge of how to put together a story was relevant, as equally relevant back then as it is today. So um, let's dive into some of his opinions on how to put together a tragedy in particular. So 6 elements of a tragedy. First, you should have a plot, which is a sequence of actions. You've got to worry about the characters, like define them and include their purpose, the way they react, their beliefs, and so forth. You've got to worry about the thoughts. These are triggered by speech rather than plot actions. Diction, that is the dialogue, what's actually said. Uh, in the Poetics, I remember this is 350 BC, he talked about songs, and these days for a movie it might be more like background music or something like that, but it was a particular way that people were putting together tragedies back in a few thousand years ago. And then there's spectacle. Like these days, I'd be considering things like special effects, but it covers things like the richness of the sets and the props. And so all of these things need to be taken into account when putting together a good tragedy, according to Aristotle. So the plot, it's easier to make actions interesting than just having two people talking to each other and trying to be interesting. So things actually happen rather than just two people sitting at a table and talking for an hour on. It's just it's harder to make that exciting and interesting. Also, the actions of the characters tend to be more important than why they did it. People see their actions, see what they do. It's it takes more effort to get into their mind and understand what's going on. It doesn't mean that motivation doesn't matter, but the actions speak louder than anything. And as a general recommendation he had was to always avoid content that's not relevant to the plot. If it's not pushing the story forward, get rid of it. Two concepts that came up a fair bit, in particular this is for tragedies, was fear and pity. So fear is someone that we emphasize with undergoing something bad's happening to them. And the reason that we get scared or we feel fear is because we can relate to that person. So that's why the empathy aspect is very similar. So if you want to create fear in an audience, somehow they've got to relate to the character who's going through that problem. Pity is a little bit different. It's someone you can still emphasize this with, but it wasn't their fault. It was unmerited. It was just something that's happened to them. Now, you still want that to be a tragedy should have a series of plot events that logically trigger that fear or pity. It's not just, oh, I was walking down the street and suddenly got hit by a meteorite. Oh, well, that's terrible. But there's no logic to it. There was nothing that came up to it. There was no announcement there was going to be a meteor shower in advance. And so there should be a causal effect to put it together. Another aspect is tragedies are more likely to have more impact if they're between friends. And this fits into some other psychology I heard about once, which was about spheres of influence. The people that can hurt you the most are the people that are closest to you because you trust them. And so they have a bigger impact on you. If you don't like somebody and you don't know them very well and they say something bad about you can usually just brush that off. But when it's a close friend that says something bad about you, that can really hurt. Impact's also increased if there's a bit of a surprise. It's got to be logical, it's got to be sensible, but if something can come up and sort of like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, that can also increase the impact of fear or pity. Also, hey, it's a tragedy. It may be obvious, but things get worse in tragedies. And the idea is basically if everything just got better and everything was wonderful, and if there's no conflict, there's no challenge, the story can be fairly boring, especially if it's a tragedy. It wouldn't really be called a tragedy anymore. Other concepts are reversals and recognition. So a reversal is something that goes opposite to a plan. I've got an example just in a moment. Recognition is if somebody thinks something through and sort of comes to an understanding, a realization um, of some fact or point just through logical thinking. So a simple plot is where you can change your fortune. There's a change of fortune going on, but there's no reversal or recognition. What's more interesting is when you have a complex plot where there is a reversal or recognition or both. Um, and reversals are best if it's due to some error or mistake or frailty or weakness. Or there's got to be a reason for it, but there are particular reasons that have more impact. Now, I quite like anime, and I'm trying to do an animated cartoon. So, one scene you often see in anime is at high school, a girl cooks some cookies for a boy, but then tries to give them to her, but she falls over and crushes them instead, and then she runs away crying. And that's a reversal because she was looking forward to really giving it to the boy, and then the opposite happened. She couldn't. It was worse. She destroyed the cookies, and it didn't go according to plan at all. Now, an example of recognition is if the boy wonders, oh, why did she cook cookies? And sort of thinks it through and suddenly realizes, oh, hang on, she might like me. And maybe that was the reason. And so that's an example of recognition. So if you can get both of them, one is a reversal, something doesn't go according to plan, and recognition, that somebody actually understands what's going on, that can help build up the impact of in a tragedy of the storyline. Characters, just briefly, they should have a purpose. It can be good, it can be bad, doesn't really matter. But everything they say or do should reinforce that purpose. In real world, people are not quite so black and white. They've got more shades of grey. But you can't really get that across necessarily in a story online. So it's better to have more clear that somebody can get just by watching your show or your episode what that person's opinion and what their perspective on life is and so forth. The better it is and the clearer it comes across. So don't try and get too fancy with individual characters. That's the end of part one. I've got some other parts coming up. I'm going to talk a little bit more about other topics in terms of heroic journey, Greytag's pyramid, and some other sources of information I came across, including some Pixar in a box. But I hope you found this episode useful. Thank you.